just quick introductions. My name is Tim Chase. Most of my time these days is spent kind of running an sharing community, a collective defense community called the Manufacturing ISAC, or the Information Sharing and Analysis Center. Nonprofit organization, just helps connect manufacturers to each other and to share threats, vulnerabilities, incidents that they're seeing, and kind of combine them and partner with outside organizations that also can provide some meaningful insights. Like Larry, who's currently a member, but also has deep technical experience, and so it's been a wealth of experience and a valuable member of the ISAC. So, Larry, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, so Larry Gray, Director of Business Development, OT Infrastructure and Security for a company called the OSIS Group. We do system integration in about every vertical you can imagine, although primarily food and beverage and what we call heavy industry, so steel, specialty chemical, those types of industries. Been working in the security space for more than 15 years now. Excited to be working with Tim for the last year or so, essentially helping kind of build manufacturing ISAC out and get more involved both as a user, since we build any electrical panels and things of that nature, as well as an SME to help build credibility and content.
Excellent. So because it's short, we're just going to jump into the content. But I want to make two things, kind of caveats. One is because it's so short, there's a couple of disclaimers. One is it's a short time, so the amount of depth that we can go into is not going to be super deep. So we're going to disappoint everyone at least somewhat. Either it wasn't technical enough or it's too technical. I'm hoping that there'll be something that's going to be useful for everyone at the end. And if not, then I think that there's an ability to connect with us so we can provide additional resources to you. So with that, we'll go ahead and get into the weeds. So I've been in the information sharing space in ISAC, supporting a number of different critical and vital infrastructures for the last 10 years. So in the last three, I've been focusing more on communities that have operational technology as a core component of their business vertical. Manufacturing ISAC, as I said, where I spend most of my time now, being one of those. And in that space, I'm a bit of an avid 8K reader. So for those who are unfamiliar, an 8K is companies that are publicly traded. If they have an incident, it doesn't necessarily have to be cybersecurity, but sometimes it is, that is has the potential to be materially impactful to the organization, where it might affect their earnings or something for that quarter. They have to file that with the SEC. So whenever they have like a ransomware incident or something else that is material, they file an 8K disclosure. And so in the cybersecurity world, we oftentimes look at those because for publicly traded companies, at least, it's a good early indicator of what's going on, what may have happened, and how that might affect the organization. So um, I read a lot of AKs, and I read a lot of AKs, unfortunately, about manufacturers, particularly as it relates to ransomware incidents. And as I've been reading these, a few things keep happening. Number one, I keep reading things about, also, I should mention that these 8K disclosures, because they're for a regulatory agency, right, that has not only, you could be charged criminally potentially if you're making false claims. The amount of lawyers that are parsing every single word in an 8K disclosure is pretty significant. So when you read the 8K, every single word is very intentional. So anyway, I'm reading all these 8Ks, and they have different terms they might use, a breach or unauthorized access or compromise of a digital system. But it always specifies typically that it was an IT system. And I don't think that that's because, as I just mentioned, that the lawyers don't know the difference between an IT system and an OT system. I think that they're intentionally choosing the word IT and not OT. But they'll oftentimes follow that by saying that an OT system was taken offline out of an abundance of caution, or production needed to be halted while systems were mitigated. But if it was only affecting the IT system, why would they need to take the OT system offline? And that's really kind of what prompted me to think, like, wait a second, if there's no intrusion into the OT system, why did production have to stop? This is somewhat unique in some ways to manufacturing, in ways that it isn't quite as problematic in, say, electrical or oil and gas, or maybe water or wastewater in terms of OT systems. But in manufacturing in particular, they have some unique IT dependencies that can affect those OT systems. So I started digging and, talking with people like Larry and the members, we're seeing why that might be. Number one, in manufacturing, those enterprise resource planning tools, right, that they're using, and almost every single manufacturer is using some form of an ERP and some other things as well. But why is the ERP that might be compromised in an adverse like cyber incident affecting the OT space? Well, oftentimes it's just because the ERP is kind of vulnerable in and of itself. The number of people have access. So the ERP is sort of tracking everything that is happening in the manufacturer from sort of like taking orders all the way to fulfillment, right? Everything along that continuum. So everyone is touching that along the way and the level of access they have too. Maybe you can lock them down into one or a couple of different areas, but they all generally have read-write privileges. And then most of the time, they're in a cloud SaaS platform. It could be hybrid, but usually cloud. So it's pretty vulnerable. It's hard to sort of lock that down. But the reason why it might affect the OT system is that many times the manufacturing environment itself is pulling data from the ERP that informs what it's actually making. So it's the actual orders that tell the manufacturing process what they're going to make, right? Who it's for, all that information. So this is the problem with ERPs. So in discussion with Larry and kind of drilling down and discussing that ERPs are vulnerable, the issue of IT dependencies into the OT space for manufacturing. In discussion with Larry, I find out, is it just ERPs, Larry?
No, unfortunately, right? I mean, it'd be one thing if we could just say, hey, it's just ERP systems, but the reality is, in some cases, ERP may directly impact operational technology, but you've got a lot of intermediate systems essentially that are actually managing the information flow in and out that are typically on the enterprise IT side of the environment. And so we've got material tracking systems that become a problem, cloud-based multivariate process control systems. I mean, that's one that's becoming increasingly popular. I've seen more of, and am at least familiar with one facility that, while it wasn't a complete stoppage, it was a reduction in rate as a result of being unable to use a more efficient process for running their systems. MES platforms are often exposed, right? And so, that really is where you've got intermediate information associated with what you're doing from a production perspective. You're tracking, you're shipping and receiving, those types of things. And then occasionally you run into issues with just being able to do EPA reporting and regulatory compliance. So if you're pushing data to a cloud-based historian or repository of some sort, and that is your system of record, you may actually end up having to shut down because you can't for sure
Right.
verify what you're actually doing in a
So, so it's not just ERPs, it's a whole list of things, particularly in manufacturing, that have IT dependencies into the OT space that would either significantly reduce or stop an OT process if those systems became unavailable or they had limited connectivity.
Yep.
So that leads us to the some of the next steps. And for this discussion, I wanted to say at the outset, this is going to seem a lot like sort of cyber hygiene or best practices for OT cybersecurity. And I know that that's not a fan favorite. Larry and I have promised that we'll stop bringing it up when you start doing it. So, with that being said, Larry can tell us a little bit about what we can do to minimize us being targeted in the first place.
Yeah, so we'll go through this really quickly because again, we don't have a lot of time here. But leveraging a zero trust solution on both the IT and OT systems, so reducing the number of people that have access, actually doing continuous authorization to be sure somebody has valid access, some type of a segmented architecture, so being able to provide additional mechanisms effectively for disconnecting or segmenting off one part to another. And I don't want to steal my thunder later, but that becomes critical as you're designing strategies for doing incident response. And then leveraging next gen firewalls, making sure you're not just doing three tuple type or five tuple type filtering, but you're actually looking at layer 7 traffic where you can, and then deploying an industrial DMZ with some type of a proxy in order to segment off the traffic that you've got moving north and south through the environment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that Larry and I, on multiple occasions, have kind of gotten into the weeds in discussions about what zero trust looks like in an OT environment and how deep that can actually go. That's a bigger can of worms that we're going to leave closed for this discussion, unless we have time at the end, and then we can crack that can open if you want to talk about that. But we'll go ahead and move on um, to kind of some of the main issues, which is what are those IT dependencies? How do we find them? And how do we go about kind of some of the things that we can do once we've established what they are, to monitor them and see what we can do to kind of minimize the risk they pose?
Yeah, so Chris McGoffin kind of stole our thunder a little bit earlier, talking about making sure you've got a playbook for disconnected operation, right? So at the
Right.
end of the day, what all these are about is finding those ITOT dependencies so that you can put together an incident response plan that allows you to do that. How do you find those? You know, in a perfect world, you do an OT risk assessment. In many instances, that's just more than most people are willing to take on. So you kind of break that apart into two big pieces. One is meeting with all the stakeholders, right? Getting operations, engineering, and maintenance into a room and sitting down and saying, okay, kind of a pre-tabletop exercise. What if you had to operate without the IT systems being available? What gets impacted? And then once you understand what they understand, actually looking at traffic, because what we found typically is even after you have those conversations, when you actually start looking at north southbound traffic, you find all kinds of dependencies that people just missed, right? Things they didn't realize necessarily they were even doing or that had been automated in some way, shape, or form. So collecting that span traffic, really looking at what's going in and out of the environment. And in a perfect world, if you can do it, deploying some type of an OT NSM tool so that you don't just have a point in time picture of what's going on, but you've got a roadmap that's more accurate over time. And as you make changes, as you make additions, you can't essentially do that in the dark anymore. You're actually exposing what's actually going on.
Yeah, and I want to touch on a couple of these just because I know just anecdotally when I hear from members thinking about OT risk assessments, they are either from a lot of those members' perspectives or prospect members, they're either well, in all cases, they seem quite overwhelmed by the prospect of doing that because it's either for them going to be a massive, like daunting task to try to undertake that themselves, or it's something that they're going to contract out, which has a lot of zeros, a number with a lot of zeros behind it. And I think that, as Larry and I have talked about this, the reason that we have meet with operations, engineering, and maintenance is that those people are the keys to actually building out both the dependencies, but also kind of understanding where the risk actually lies with those dependencies, because they already have much of this done in their safety planning. They understand if you poke here, what breaks. And that basically is going to help you to build out some of that risk assessment because they have a lot of that information. You've got to go a step further, and then, as Larry's already alluded to, meet with additional stakeholders because you have to kind of move upstream of that operational environment to try to understand where the IT portion of some of those risks lie, and not just what the effects will be in the OT environment. But that's basically the best place to start, and they have a lot of information that can kind of basically help to prioritize where you're going to focus on the risk reduction itself. And also, I don't know if this steals the thunder for a future slide, but when we're talking about like deploying, an NSM tool, I think what we're talking about is a lot of companies right now are going through a process of sort of like moving to, Industry 4.0, a lot more digitization and cloud compute and everything around their manufacturing environment. And so what we're suggesting is essentially you can do some of these things where you get more bang for your buck if you're doing them together at once versus having something set up and then having to work backwards and try to fit something in later, shoehorning it in. Because while I'm perfectly happy for Larry as an integrator to come back and undo some things and add some things, it's cheaper to kind of think about that as you're kind of rolling out deployment of new tooling. Any other comments on this before we move on?
No, just kind of to add on to what you're saying, we do a lot of basically digital transformation types of processes for customers. And one of the things that we try to do, which is really kind of the first bullet on the next slide, is help them think through incident response planning as a part of actually designing an MES deployment so that you're not going in after the fact and trying to figure out how do I operate with this thing disconnected, but you've already made the decision. What's that going to look like, and started to build that capability in up front.
Yep. All right. Well, we'll go there next. All right. So now we're on to the minimizing impact. And so go ahead, Larry, pick up on the IR planning.
Yeah, so one of the biggest things, right, is a whole lot easier when you got the time to sit down and talk through a problem. Kind of back to the operations maintenance folks, building incident response plans before you need them, because when you're in the middle of an incident response, isn't the time to figure out that, oh, there's this other dependency that we really hadn't thought about. If I go back to the SANS 5 critical controls as an example, right? Number one is an OT specific incident response plan. And so when we say IR here, we really are talking about an OT specific incident response plan. Once you have those plans, run tabletop exercises with them. Don't just write them and assume they're correct, but actually play them out. What does it look like to actually do a tabletop exercise with whatever incident response plan you're specifically looking at, right? Is it the ERP system that's impacted? Is it all enterprise IT that's impacted? What does it look like essentially to actually operate in a disconnected state? And then provide and use secure remote access, right? Don't become a victim essentially of ransomware on the enterprise IT side that basically leaks through because you didn't do a good job of actually designing a way of leveraging secure remote access into the environment, which coincidentally is back to, I think, number 3 on the SANS 5 critical. And then designing your interfaces for disconnected operation up front. I kind of alluded to this a minute ago, but when we have the opportunity, when I say greenfield, I don't mean like new facility. I mean like new digital transformation effort, right? So we're actually going to build out a new solution to solve a business problem. Let's talk about what you need to do from an incident response perspective now, because if we talk about it now, we can build that functionality in up front. It's going to cost less at the end of the day. You're going to have more options in how you go about solving that problem, and you're going to have lower risk. When you're coming in after the fact and something already exists, it's a little bit like bolting security on at the end. It's a much more difficult problem to solve, and your options that you have essentially available to you actually become more limited as well. You're muted, Tim.
Yeah, thanks, Larry, for clearing up that. We wanted to make sure that we were going to describe what we meant about greenfield and brownfield in this context.
Yep.
This is just kind of in general in terms of OT operations, um, and just kind of reinforcing some of the points that Larry's made. Number one, we absolutely, at Manufacturing ISAC, we absolutely agree with running tabletops with what you have. Tabletop exercises are, I mean, if done well, are really, really helpful because they're helpful for evaluating what you have already to improve it. And also they're helpful to understand how people are using it, even if you don't think that you have a whole lot. It can be helpful in both the IT and the OT. It's basically tabletops are a lot like, a gym membership or, other things. It's like you're going to get out of it what you put into it. So, the more people that you have in terms of roles inside of your organization that choose to participate, um, the better off kind of the lessons learned will be. Um, this is not a paid plug because it's completely free, but our organization runs, we have one coming up soon on a communications disruption. So basically could affect both IT and OT. It's completely free to attend. It's a tabletop exercise where we're going to go through sort of a communications disruption. So if you're interested, you can just email me or put something in the Q&A or something, and I can give you information about that. Additionally, I don't know, Larry, if you get $1 for every single time you bring up SANS 5 controls. Uh, I think it's contractually obligated for SANS instructors, which you are.
Maybe.
Yeah, but it's true because everything usually comes back to some pretty foundational elements. Now, just because they're fairly simple doesn't mean they're easy, but I think that they're important as that foundation that other things get built on top of. And it becomes more precarious when you don't have that foundation and you're building more stuff on top of that. So And again, on the interfaces for disconnected operation, that's really where Larry and I's conversation over time has focused because kind of circling back to my initial opening, there's a problem that I see. Larry and I at S4 were talking about how the IT side can be disrupted, right? And it has OT effects into the OT environment. But I was saying, most of the time the disruptions on the IT side are fairly short-lived. Variations to be sure, but how would it be possible, or would it be possible, to what extent would it be possible to sort of create, a shock absorber inside of the OT environment so that it could have additional information to be able to be disconnected and still continue operations at or near kind of pre-disruption levels. And that's really where I think most of the focus of our conversation has been. And so with that, we'll go to the next slide, which really just focuses and drills down on sort of like designing for disconnected operations. What do we need to think about here?
Yeah, so these are really the questions that we like to ask, right? I mean, think about how long do you need to operate in a disconnected state, and what that really drives at the end of the day is how much data do I need to buffer? What's that look like? And can I even do that, right? If I look at things from a sales perspective, how do I actually go about making sure that I know what orders I need to produce next, or what materials I need to be able to produce those orders? How do I actually be sure what my inventory looks like? Those kinds of things. And so those are all can be challenging problems to solve when your ERP system's not available, and that's where the data repository normally lives. So if I can cache that forward in an MES system and then provide appropriate security controls around an MES, then I've got it in a place where I can operate it, and it not is not likely going to become a victim of the same ransomware attack as the ERP platform. I'm in a much better state. Um, as a part of that as well, once you have that kind of information, working back from the data into the upstream digital and human systems. So kind of alluded to, that sales plan or that production planning process. What's that look like? How do we build tools to allow somebody to do production planning when they can't do it in their ERP, assuming that they normally use their ERP to do that type of thing? Um,
Yep.
and then is there any kind of short-term solution that becomes an easy solve, right? Is there intermediate products that I can immediately switch onto as a manufacturer and continue to run my line? Or is there some kind of high quantity product that I manufacture that we can just go start building a lot of widget X and storing those away somewhere essentially, so that when I get my ERP platform back up and I'm able to start shipping, I can do those kinds of things again. So, these are the kinds of questions we like to work through with customers, and think through and try to help customers solve these types of problems again ahead of actually needing it.
Yeah, and so the couple things here, the working back from the data upstream, digital and human systems. So that really focuses on the fact that some of those things are pieces of information that if you could acquire those and store those in a different place. You could store them in sort of a disconnected repository that could be, kind of break glass in case of an event that you could plug in. That could be sort of like recipes or process data for a production environment. And those are somewhat easier to replicate. The reason that we have digital and human systems is that pretty quickly you're gonna run into human and or physical limitations. So like it's not just, the ERP is kind of handling everything in terms of, the ringmaster for everyone to see in one pane of glass where everything is in process, but it's working upstream because you're gonna have to talk to like Stephanie in procurement, right? Because in order to get the stuff that you need to make the product, she had to have ordered that in the first place, right? So what is her timeline in terms of ordering? What is your availability to stock, ahead of orders coming in? So that's a business decision, right? So, you can buy down some risk in terms of like loss of production time, but at what cost? So you got to start doing some of those cost benefit analysis.
Yep.
And that's where really some of these last 2 points here, the working back and the intermediate or high quality products, these are really kind of trying to help and crack the nut of like lost time in the production environment and minimizing, business disruption, right? So maybe it's not possible to stock all of the things necessary for the current set of products that you would have made, but you have you have enough product on hand that you have that necessary to make this certain subset of those products so that you're not down during that process, even though you can't stock everything, you can't make the specific products, you're not losing factory time so that there's still productivity that's going on even as IT systems are being kind of brought back online. So those are some of our thoughts. We were hoping, as I always am, that the conversation itself is not going to be, the final word on this. It's really just a start of a conversation, particularly that I want to have with asset owners to see how they're doing this. You know what I forgot to do? I forgot to ask the polls.
I started to suggest that you might want to go back. We're going to ask either of the polls. We only have about 3 minutes, so
Yeah, so well, we'll go ahead and do the first poll then, which is basically how many organizations have actually thought about OT dependent OT systems that are dependent on IT. So that's the first poll, and we'll give that a couple minutes. Larry, you have any final thoughts as people are putting their answers in the poll?
if you could flip forward maybe to the last slide, because one of the things that we were asked to do was spend a little bit of time thinking about, what do you do in the next 3 to 6 months, right?
Right.
So I think the first thing is getting executive buy-in, right? Making sure that you've got the leadership team essentially on board with doing something here, because it's going to take time. It's going to take people's resources, which is the probably the most valuable resource ultimately in most organizations. Get out there and really identifying those IT dependencies so that you're not caught off guard. You know what to expect, and then thinking it through how you connect the people as well as the digital systems, right? Because oftentimes we talk about the challenges that exist between OT and IT, but it's a pretty real thing. OT and engineering thinks very differently than IT does in general. So that's interesting that it's actually much higher than what I would have guessed. I mean, I can tell you from our experience, it's well under 50-50 that have thought about how they would operate in a disconnected state. So exciting to see that it's almost 2/3 of people that are putting time thinking into that. Go ahead. The last question we had up here was if you're willing to share, how long can you operate with your IT dependencies down? In other words, you've lost your ERP platform, you've lost your enterprise IT systems. Can you run for a shift? Can you run for a day? If you could go ahead and respond to that, it'd be interesting to hear that as well. And Tim, do you want to have any closing thoughts?
Yeah, no, I definitely want to agree with most of these things start and the cycle both in authorization and kind of completion with executive buy-in. So that's really important because in all those things they have to sort of see the business side of it. And I think that there are definitely ways of making the case why this is important to do, particularly for manufacturing where there is inherently a lot of risk that's involved in it. And if you can sort of buy down that risk by preparing the organization better, also, as Larry has mentioned, doing certain things sort of like, you know, uh, doing multiple things at the same time to sort of like minimize the cost, but also the benefit as you're modernizing systems is really helpful. And then what can you do to substitute manually? Increasingly, that's getting tougher and tougher. Frankly, to be quite honest, what you can do run manually. But I think that most of the things are really just trying to help understand like what is possible and to like the second question about like how long you can go. If you could extend, by 100%, so like maybe it was one shift, it was 8 hours. If you could move that to 16 hours, that would be a huge win for your organization. So I'll go ahead and leave it there. I see that Mike's back on, so that means our time's over.
Mike's about to kick us off.
Larry, yeah, Larry and Tim, but thank you very much. I have a couple of follow-up questions, but we'll have to catch up on the on the side. So,
Please
but
do.
yeah, I appreciate it, gentlemen, and I know everybody else did and got a lot out of the presentation. So the other track is or the other sessions are starting. So we'll see everybody over in those. All right,
Perfect.
thanks again.
Thanks, everybody.
All right, take
Bye.
care.
You too, everybody.